So, welcome to Grow with the Flow for a very special episode. It's the first time I have a guest on this podcast, and I'm very honored that Lauren is here. Let me
I'm
introduce
very
you.
good. Yeah.
Lauren is an author and a mother of two from Australia. She's written a book about building a compassionate relationship with ourselves through panic and anxiety. And she runs a podcast and a YouTube channel on agoraphobia, panic disorder, and toilet anxiety, and is a big believer in books, cups of teas, and laughter.
Yes.
So,
Yes.
Lauren, welcome to this show, this episode. And as I said, yeah, the very first time we have an interview guest here.
Yeah. I'm very excited. I haven't done one of these in a while, so hopefully I don't I don't mess up your first one.
I can guarantee you any messing up will be done by me. I feel that that's my responsibility as the host. I'll take that on my shoulders. Maybe you can start by telling a little bit about yourself and kind of sharing your story with agoraphobia and anxiety.
Mm-hmm. Sure. So I have always had challenging mental health from an early age, I guess, but mostly dealt with depression. So anxiety was something that was quite new to me until my early 20s. It sort of came completely out of left field, as it often does for young women. I had my first panic attack when I was in my early 20s. And looking back, I can see now that there were maybe things that sort of contributed to it. But at the time, it just seemed to come out of absolutely nowhere. I thought that I was having some kind of medical episode. I thought, I don't know, I thought I was sick with something because it was the symptoms that I had were very sort of gastrointestinal. Like I had, a stomach ache and felt like I really needed to go to the bathroom and had diarrhea and just felt not right. And this happened while I was working a shift at one of the part-time jobs that I had. So I went home from that shift that day thinking that I was unwell. And then I came back to work the next day and it happened again in a similar fashion. Like it just sort of came completely out of nowhere. But then when it happened, it was all-consuming. And this time it felt more alarming than when it happened the day before, because this time I had that sort of context that 10 minutes ago I'd been completely fine. I knew I wasn't sick. I knew I hadn't been sick in the night. I didn't have any tummy issues or anything. I had been completely fine, completely happy, completely normal. And then bang, it was like I just couldn't function. Had diarrhea again, had a stomach ache, felt cold and hot, and it was like every possible sensation I could imagine was suddenly happening in my body. And from that day, it was a pretty slippery slope of those sort of attacks happening more frequently. It was often when I would leave the house, when I would be in the car, when I would be, going somewhere to socialize. And I was a really busy person. I was somebody who had many jobs on the go, was, liked to travel overseas, go out at night with friends, and, sort of always doing things at all hours. And to then suddenly become somebody who freaked out every time I left the house, it was really jarring. And I didn't really understand what was happening. And this went on for about nearly a year, where these sort of attacks, I still didn't know they were panic attacks. I didn't know they were anxiety. I still thought it was something happening physically in my gut. These sort of attacks kept happening. And it got to the stage where I couldn't work anymore. I couldn't leave the house. I just was a shell of my former self. And I kept going to doctors and saying, something is wrong with my gut, something is happening. Like I keep getting this sense of urgency and this need to go to the bathroom. And I was really embarrassed to talk about it at the time because it was not something I had dealt with before. And so I was sort of telling the doctors a little bit of what was happening, but not, completely sharing every part of it. But I had lots of tests done, like a colonoscopy and blood tests and breath tests and all sorts of different things, trying to figure out what was happening with my gut. I was completely healthy. There was nothing happening with my gut. So I ended up getting diagnosed with IBS for kind of lack of, there being something else to point the finger at. But even so, being diagnosed with IBS, I still couldn't figure out why it was every time I left the house, I just seemed to get these symptoms. And so, became housebound within the space of about a year after this first started. And then I was housebound for 2 years. I actually had a conversation with my 10-year-old daughter the other day where I was telling her about agoraphobia, because there's a new Sabrina Carpenter song where she says, "I hope you get agoraphobia." And and I was laughing and I was like, "Oh, that's not very nice." And she's like, "What's that?" And I said, "Oh, it's this thing that I had." And so I was explaining it to her. And she's like, "So hang on, you didn't leave the house for 2 years?" And I'm like, "I didn't leave the house for 2 years." She goes, "But not even to the shop?" I'm like, "Not even to the shop." Like, did not leave the house. She's like, "What?" But yeah, so my life fell apart, and I feel like I'm waffling a lot. But basically, shit got really bad, had a really hard time. And it wasn't until I had my 10-year-old daughter, she's now 10, but it wasn't until I had her that I started trying to challenge the fear of getting out and about again. By this time, sorry, I jumped ahead a bit. By this time, I had been diagnosed with agoraphobia by my doctor. Around the time when I stopped leaving the house for 2 years, they were like, "Ooh, this is a little bit more than IBS. You may have an anxiety disorder." So yeah, that's the beginning of the end, or the end of the beginning. So yeah.
Do you feel like that diagnosis of IBS, is that something that you actually kind of related to, or do you feel like it was actually just a diagnosis of a doctor who didn't really know much better themselves?
It's hard. I relate to it a lot more now. I definitely know that I do deal with a functional gut disorder. And I think that back then, this was, 11, 12 years ago, I feel like they didn't know anywhere near as much as they know now about IBS. And I feel like back then it was a diagnosis that you got when all other options had been exhausted. Whereas I feel like now they diagnose it and they're quite certain that this is a functional gut disorder. It's a legitimate thing. But I will never know which one came first. Was it the IBS that came first, or the anxiety that came first that caused the IBS? I think that's where the real sort of mystery is for me.
Yeah, because I remember I was on a very similar path, right, where I at some point went through the phase of getting all the health checks done to kind of at least eliminate that anything is going on there. And I remember my doctor sitting there, and he was like, "Well, what you're describing could easily be a symptom of IBS," but he said it's quite difficult to test for IBS, or to get kind of diagnose it with a lot of kind of confidence and certainty, because it's always a little bit vague, because it's a bit of a spectrum. So in my case, he even mentioned, and this is now, I cannot imagine how it would have been like even 10, 12 years ago, when even the topic of anxiety and mental health was probably a very different one. So I think having to deal with it today is one thing, but having to deal with those things 10, 12 years ago, where, something like anxiety probably carries a lot more shame, because you feel so much more alienated from your peers, right? Because it's this being different and the shame that kind of comes with it, I suppose.
Yeah, definitely. And I at the time, being in my early 20s, I feel like it wasn't I don't know, maybe it was the friend circle that I was in, but there wasn't a lot of like gut issues and things like that. Whereas now in my mid to late 30s, everyone's like, I'm suddenly lactose intolerant, and everyone can't deal with wheat anymore. And it's much more common now to have gut issues. Whereas in the early 20s, it was like everyone was going out partying and they're like, "What do you mean you have gut issues?" Like, it sort of it really did feel very isolating.
Yeah, I can imagine. And like, tell me about that period when you were housebound for so long, because obviously, especially in your 20s, when most people thinking back to the 20s was all about being out, being around, adventures. I remember a friend of mine actually went to Australia, after they
Yeah.
finished high school, they would do a little bit of a work and travel experience. So I feel like the
Mm.
20s is a lot about like going out, expressing yourself, and kind of getting out into the world for the first time, which can obviously be
Yeah.
quite intimidating. But for you, it was quite the opposite. How was that?
Mm. It was really hard, because like you, all of my friends were traveling. Everyone was, taking years off and going overseas, and my family are all sort of in different locations around Australia. And I used to live overseas in my teens, so I was already somebody who really liked to travel, and it felt, again, very isolating being someone who couldn't even, like, it wasn't even travel. Like, I couldn't even go have a coffee with a friend round down the corner, and I was in a long-term relationship at the time, and that it was a huge, huge strain on that relationship, because my boyfriend went from having a travel buddy and a party buddy to having a girlfriend who was always at home, and every party, every invitation, he would say, oh, Lauren's not feeling well, so she's not coming. And it kind of just got to the point where I don't even think, people didn't expect me to show up anywhere, because they knew there was no way I was going to come.
Mm.
And then it was hard because I'd still get invited to some things. Like, I remember some weddings and things, I would get the invite, and I remember feeling at the time really frustrated, because I'm like, don't they know that I can't come to this? Like, it felt, looking back now, I know that of course they were just trying to be nice and include me, but at the time
Yeah.
I felt so much pressure to try and attend and to make excuses, and to, it was, the whole 2 years was the worst I ever felt about myself. And I felt like I was letting everyone down, and myself, and that my life was passing by.
Yeah, I can sadly relate a lot to that. You're so much in your head in those moments, right? Like very typical with anxiety, you're overthinking. Everything that is happening around you seems to be geared towards that problem. Now you know that this
Yeah.
was all these invitations and all of these efforts to get you out of the house and spend time with you came from a place of love, of people that missed you, that love you and love hanging out with you. But then you're on the other side seeing this, and you're experiencing no love at all, but it's just pressure, and it's more of that
Mm.
downward spiral. And
Mm.
even the impact on relationship for me was similar, I think,
Yeah.
because when you're in a situation when you can't communicate those things very clearly, you feel so alone, right? There's this embarrassment talking about it, especially with a partner. And I
Mm.
think looking back at my previous relationship, I can obviously only understand how much strain that must have been for them to, because again, I think if you support your partner through thick and thin, you there's probably only so much you can do. At some point, if you feel like, okay, where else could this go? Or what else can
Mm.
we do here? Especially if there's no kind of clear understanding, you can
Mm.
really feel how, of course, it must be super difficult for them as well, which of course, in that moment, it's hard to realize and appreciate.
Yeah, I think it comes down to that whole mental illness feeling like a burden,
Mm,
and why, not to get super dark, but why a lot of people, start to feel suicidal, because it's that sense that not only are you missing out on your own life, but you're making the people you love miss out on living their life to the fullest, and that pressure feels like a lot. And yeah, I, especially as a young adult,
mm.
maybe a relationship later on in life, yeah, for better or worse, but an early 20s relationship, it's like, I did not sign up for this, so yeah.
Which is probably fair enough, yeah.
Yeah.
What was the turning point for you
Sorry,
when you?
that's my dog. um the
Yeah,
turning point was having my daughter, and it's funny, I have a video where I talk about this on my channel, and there's
exactly.
been, out of the like fairly few comments. There's one or two here and there where people are like, I don't understand how you went to hospital and had a baby if you didn't leave the house. Like, that doesn't add up. And if I could only explain the lengths that I had to go to get to hospital to have my baby, like it was weeks of planning. And, you know, I had an elective cesarean because I had to control the outcome. I could not just spontaneously go into labor. Like, I had to know the date and time I was going to have this child.
Wow.
And coming home from the hospital, I had a blanket over my head. My baby wasn't even in the car with me. She came home with my mum later. I could not. I did it, but it was one of the hardest things I've ever done. And the hospital was only like 10 minutes from my house. So it's pretty wild to think back how difficult that was for me. But after I had my eldest daughter, I realized that she was going to miss out on having a mum in her life everywhere but at home. And I know babies don't really care about that. Babies just want you wherever you are. They're not really bothered. But, you know, things like taking her to get her vaccinations and taking her to the mother's group and her maternal health appointments, I really struggled with. And I would send her off to these things with her dad, and I would think, I'm failing her. Like, you know, she's going to get a needle jabbed in her thigh and I'm not going to be there to hold her when she cries. And it destroyed me thinking that. So that was when I was like, I've got to start getting out there. And she was my little sidekick, and we would just go on walks together and go on little trips together in the car. Like 5 minutes down the road, I would pack up everything in the car that I thought I would need for a little 5 minute trip out of the house. And then we'd come home again. And I just built up from there. So that was the turning point, realizing that like this innocent child was gonna miss out on things for my comfort, and it didn't sit well with me.
So it really, but obviously that didn't fix it for you, right? Having a daughter, but it seemed like that having a daughter probably pushed a lot of these underlying issues, because I think that's what we often realize is that the toilet anxiety is rarely the issue itself, right? It's usually the symptom. And
Yeah.
I think finding what is underneath, you know, all of this toilet anxiety, to understand like what is the trauma that we actually deal with, I think is often the biggest journey. It seems in your case, you know, becoming a mother, set whatever that trauma was aside and said like, okay, that's not a priority. Your child is obviously a priority. And before we dive more into that underlying anxiety, because I think that's a really interesting topic, like, so having a daughter was obviously the initial trigger to where you realize, okay, I need to now change this. Now I just realized my cat is
I love it. My dog, your cat, it's all happening.
they will just be extras in this in this call.
Unpaid extras.
So having your daughter was obviously the initial trigger that made you realize, okay, it can't continue like this any longer. But then it doesn't fix it like that, right? So what did you do to kind of get out of you know, being bound at home?
Yeah.
Okay, before I just need to close the door. The cat is starting to meow.
Bless her.
Here we go.
So the funny thing with anxiety, and I think so many people can relate to this, is that you look for the thing that is going to fix you, and you're like researching the medication, you're researching the book, you're researching like the podcast, like what is it that's going to flick the switch? And yes, the one thing. And you know, of course, if anything, having a baby made it harder, because I'm like, shit, now I actually have to do this. Like, I can't just keep searching on Google and pretending like I'm fixing it when really I'm just delaying fixing it. I think I I realized that I had to start feeling uncomfortable, and that was maybe the biggest thing. And I think motherhood propelled me into that because motherhood is so uncomfortable. Like it's so messy and like, yeah, you're sleep deprived, you're up all night, you're like just not to put anyone off, but it's hard. Yeah, you're pushed to within like an inch of your life. And I think that realizing that I was actually capable of that, I was like, okay, like I can maybe do this. I can maybe understand that the only thing that's going to help me is to actually feel afraid. Um, and so a big part of it for me was toilet anxiety. Every time I left the house, I was like, but what if I need to poo? What if I, get explosive diarrhea? Because that was what often happened whenever I had a panic attack, that I needed the bathroom. So it wasn't like, when people say a panic attack won't kill you. I was like, I'm not afraid of that. I'm afraid that a panic attack is going to make me shit my pants. And that's a very real possibility. Like that's happened, So I didn't have that I couldn't tell myself the worst isn't going to happen. But so I just kind of had to tell myself that, like, if the worst happens, and, for me, the worst was having an accident, embarrassing myself in public. If the worst happens, you will be okay. You will continue on. Like, it's not actually going to change who you are or how your daughter sees you or any of that. So just keep going. So it was really that. It was putting myself in the car or, putting my daughter in the pram and going for a walk and just keeping on going. And it didn't always work. Like sometimes I had to come home again and use the toilet, and some days I got further than others. It was such a slow, gradual thing. But that was the only thing that fixed it, was actually doing the thing I was afraid of. Like, surprise, surprise. The only thing that takes the fear away is realizing that there's nothing really to be afraid of. So, yeah, that was what ultimately helped the most. And I get asked a lot, like, how long did it take? What exactly did you do? How did you get out of the house with agoraphobia? And the answer is so boring. It's like, I got out of the house. That was what I did. And they're like, but how? I'm like, I got out of the house. Like, that was all I could do. Like, you just have to leave the house. You just have to get in the car. And it's so uncomfortable and it sucks and you feel like you can't do it and you feel like your stomach's going to fall out of your butt and nothing about it feels good. But that's the point. You have to feel that discomfort in order for it to actually shift, because otherwise it's just this nebulous thing sitting above your head going like, you're not going to be able to cope with that. You need to actually go into it and go, oh, here I am. It sucks. I hate it, but I am coping. So yeah, that's the long answer.
But it's especially difficult because, as you said, like every day you might have a different experience. Some days you might get a little bit further, but other days you might have to return, come back home, use the bathroom again. And I think in those moments, it's so easy to, be quite mean to yourself in those moments and tell yourself that there's no progress. You're not getting through this, and there's this, this ego just talking and making the journey again more difficult for you, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Do you think that having, your daughter there with you forced you to be more present? Because I think one thing that's very interesting is you mentioned, obviously, as a young mother, life is tough, right? It's something that I've seen with some of my friends now who are young parents, and they obviously, it's not nothing that I can imagine, not being a parent yet, but the way a child impacts your life is clearly tremendous. So seeing how it might impact you in the sense that you're sleep deprived, that, obviously, as a young mother, your body is recovering from, birth and whatnot. So it's quite fascinating because before you did all those checks, from a colonoscopy to blood tests and whatever, going through all the possibilities to make sure that you're healthy, and you are. yet you're suffering so much from your anxiety. And you
Mm.
feel like, how is that possible, right? My body is completely healthy and fit and fresh, and then suddenly you're in a state where your body is not at all at its best, with like it's being sleep deprived and what else might come to it, and suddenly you're able to cope with it. So maybe the aspect is the presence, right? That you don't have time to focus much on yourself and anxiety because, well, there's another little life that you now have to look after. How did that feel like it forced you to be more present?
Yeah, I think you've definitely hit the nail on the head there. I think there was a huge amount of mental space that was taken away going out with a child. You know, you're constantly busy, especially as they get a bit older, and you're answering questions all the time, and making sure you've packed everything for them, and like, you know, stopping to breastfeed. And there was, yeah, I was present with her, and I didn't have time to be present in my own bullshit, basically, which was very helpful for sure. Uh, I like your point on the body as well, like that physicality of it. How, you know, when this first started, I'm going to the doctor and saying something's not right. Like, I'm so in tune to every little sensation in my gut. Every little time my stomach gurgles and everything, I'm like, oh, what is that? Am I going to have a diarrhea attack? You know. And then after giving birth, and I'm like leaving the house wearing these huge maxi pads, and like, you know, my body's just like doing its own thing and recovering. And I think there was a part of me that just stopped trying so hard to control how my body was feeling. Um, but maybe also there was a little bit of comfort in that sense of like, well, I'm healing. So, like, of course, my body's going to feel strange. Whereas back then, it was kind of like, why does my body feel so strange? You know, there's nothing happening. So, I don't know. It was a double-edged sword. It was good that I sort of didn't have time to assess every little twinge in my body, but I think it was also, you know, gave me a sort of an over-reliance on hiding behind a physical excuse as to why, you know, why I maybe don't feel great, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I think, well, absolutely makes sense to me. And it is quite nice to notice you're now referring to a lot of those moments, and even like the anxiety in the past tense. Like you had
Mm,
anxiety, you had those moments, right? Um,
yeah.
and even in your book, you mentioned that your book eventually, that you started the book writing about how to overcome anxiety and how to like deal with it, and maybe as an effort also to be like, okay, let's work on getting over this. But eventually you said it became a love letter to your anxious self, right? And
Yeah.
now looking on how you were able to talk about your anxiety as something that you used to suffer from, that you used to have. How
Mm.
can you tell us about that shift?
Yeah. So I should preface this by saying that I certainly do still deal with anxiety. Um, I have days where I had a day yesterday where I felt crappy and wanted to hide away and just, yeah, I still panic. I still relate very much to my anxious self, but also have a fondness for it now that I didn't have before. And yeah, when I started writing the book, I was initially so hell bent on writing something that would help people to get through, because when I first was diagnosed with agoraphobia, I Googled every night all the things I could find about agoraphobia and panic attacks. And the information out there was so divided between really scientific stuff that was very removed from the actual, how it really felt to deal with these things. And then there were these very kind of depressing, bleak stories of people who were like, I have had this for 30 years and I'm still housebound. And I was like, wow, like, this is grim. There's
Mm.
nothing inspiring here. There's nothing hopeful. Of course, there were beautiful books like Feel the Fear and Do It Anyway and those sort of stories. But the mentions of agoraphobia were small in the scheme of the book. Um, And so I really wanted to write a book that was like, here's exactly how you overcome agoraphobia. Here is exactly how it feels and how awful it is and how hard it is. And here is how you walk yourself through it. And I started writing the book as I was recovering from agoraphobia myself. So it was helpful in that way. But the book that I ended up writing is completely different to the book that I started writing, because first of all, that book wasn't very good. That was my first draft wasn't great. But also, the further I went on in my journey, I realized that I wasn't necessarily recovered completely. I hadn't overcome anything. If anything, I had become more familiar with my anxiety than ever before. I knew all the ins and outs of it. I knew exactly how it felt. I knew what it felt like to be in the middle of a panic attack at home. I knew what it felt like to be in the middle of a panic attack when you're out trying to do the thing that you're so afraid of. You know, I understood so much about my perspective on it. I felt like I'd understood a lot of, you know, other perspectives on it, interviewing lots of people, talking to lots of people. And over the years, I realized that every amazing thing I had done with anxiety, not without, not because I had learned how to overcome it and become this amazing version of myself where I was like, you can cure anxiety too. I was still incredibly anxious, still incredibly afraid, but I was doing things like traveling to New Zealand and hiking mountains and skiing and doing yoga and you know, taking plane trips overseas and doing these things that I thought I could only do once I'd beaten agoraphobia, once I'd beaten anxiety. And it wasn't the case. So that was what I ended up writing, a book about how to befriend. Sounds really cheesy when I say how to befriend anxiety. How to befriend the you that is anxious. How to make plans with the you that is anxious. How to stop thinking I can only get to where I want to be by removing these parts of me and becoming somebody else. I wanted to show people that, like, you can still do the things that you want to do. You can still have this beautiful, amazing life, and you don't have to remove parts of yourself. You actually have to invite all those parts of yourself along. And that's, for me, that was about finding wholeness, was kind of, you know, pulling all these parts of myself together and just going, okay, world, I'm here. I'm terrified. I might poop, but I'm ready. Let's go. So that's what the book is basically in a nutshell.
I think that it's so, one thing that I noticed, like watching your videos where you spoke about your experience with toilet anxiety 7 years ago, and even now hearing that story. When I watched this video, you talked about your experience at the Incubus concert, where you felt like you probably only watched, 3 or 4 songs.
Yeah.
I was just sitting there nodding the whole time at the screen, just agreeing with the screen and everything you had to say. And it was really, for me, it was really fascinating to not only see, someone else being able to share a story that it almost seems like you took a page out of the book of my life and read it out loud at times. And the things that you said, and these weren't, I haven't been to an Incubus concert, but it's the things that you felt, right? It's the things that you experienced that are so deeply personal. Where I felt like, well, I know exactly how that felt like. And then reading, I think that video sits around 50,000 views, and there's tons of comments, and most of the comments are very similar in that they sound like, oh my God, I can't believe, that someone else is experiencing that as well.
Yeah.
I thought I'm alone here. And I think I really noticed that because it's such an awkward topic, anything that has to do with pooing and with like toilet and those things, and like mental health in general is heavily stigmatized even today still. So when I started talking about this, about anxiety and about this toilet anxiety, people would often be really confused and not understand how that could be an issue because they never heard of it. So seeing exactly that, others are going through this felt felt quite fascinating. And what you're saying now is again something that I find very relatable. This idea of, okay, I just need to deal with this toilet anxiety and then I can deal with this other thing. Because obviously you realize that it feels like the toilet anxiety is stuck right in the middle, right? It's obviously a
Mm.
symptom for everything that's going on underneath, but it's also the trigger for a lot of things that happen because of it. You know, maybe how it impacts your life, your housebound, maybe your relationship is heavily impacted. So the toilet anxiety is kind of right there in the middle, fucking up everything.
Yes.
But I think that's the very interesting aspect, right? You and that's what I've been kind of exploring this year a lot personally. This idea of being ready, because what I've learned is, well, you're never going to be ready. I think you would have experienced that once you became a mom, that you felt like you probably weren't ready to be a mother, but then you just
Mm.
had to do it. And it's the same with a lot of things that I had to push myself through. I mean, this whole podcast journey, this interview now, I didn't feel that I'd be ready to interview someone, but here, 40 minutes in, we only had 2 pet related incidences, and that's it.
Doing great.
So how, yeah, how do you think others who might not suffer from toilet anxiety, but from different anxieties, could
Mm.
potentially kind of find any sort of hope, you know, if they're right in the midst of it, for example. But with that in mind, that toilet anxiety might only be a symptom for underlying things. Like, how have you been dealing with this, and what's your take on overcoming this? Because obviously, this exposure therapy that you mentioned has been a big kind of factor for you and myself as well.
Mhm.
So, what's your thought on that?
I mean, I think it's like you pointed out in the beginning, it's hard with any kind of anxiety because you are right in the midst of it, and it's all you can see and all you can think and all you can feel, and it's, you know, it's the kind of like everything in your life is colored by, you know, however your anxiety manifests, whether it's toilet anxiety, whether it's OCD, whether, you know, whatever it may be, health anxiety, I know is a big one for a lot of people. It taints everything, um, especially your perception of yourself. And I think that's why exposure therapy in particular is so helpful, because you spend so long saying, no, I can't possibly do these things because I have this anxiety. Um, and so that's all you're focusing on. This anxiety is stopping me from doing X, Y, and Z. And that becomes your identity of who you are. I'm somebody who can't do these things because of this huge bit of anxiety that's holding me back. Whereas when you start doing exposure therapy, and I use that term loosely because I know that's what I was doing, but it didn't feel very therapeutic in the sense of like I wasn't planning it in any way. I wasn't
Mm,
timing it. I wasn't, you know, there was no real methodology to it. Um, I think it's so helpful because it helps you to change your identity of who you are, because no longer are you somebody who's not doing X, Y, and Z because of the anxiety. You're somebody who's still doing those things or suddenly doing those things, and you still have this anxiety. And so the 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 stain, if you like, that anxiety has on all these parts of your life tends to sort of get smaller and smaller as your life grows with all the other things that you're doing. Um, so I think something I try to push is that I feel like people should really try and put themselves in the midst of what makes them uncomfortable, regardless of what their flavor of anxiety is. I think all the things that they feel like they are held back from, they should start aiming to do and putting themselves in that situation deliberately with the intent of panicking, with the intent of being uncomfortable, with the knowledge that the more discomfort they feel doing that, the more sort of impact it's going to have on their ability to do it in the long run. And that's what people shy away from the most. And I get a lot of, not a lot of flack, but a lot of pushback from people who say, but I don't think I should be pushing myself too hard. You know, like, I think that's too much. I shouldn't be putting myself in these situations that are like seem unbearable. And And I don't think you should slam yourself with an exposure therapy session. I don't think you should book a flight, to the other side of the world tomorrow. But I think, baby steps towards the things that really scare the shit out of you, I think are gonna have the most impact. And that's sort of what is going to build the hope for you. I think hope is one of those things that it kind of needs to grow. It's like a plant. You need to water it with like little achievements every day. Whereas when you're thinking about all the things that you need to do, it just feels overwhelming. But when you start doing these little things over and over, it's like this snowball effect. Little steps over and over time you look back and you realize, wow, I've actually done so many more things that I thought I could do. And your idea of yourself has evolved through that process. So I think even though it's a kind of feels like a big undertaking, I think it's probably ultimately the most helpful thing.
Do you think that this anxiety, maybe with your personal experience, is something that looking back at it has helped you in some ways? Or is maybe you might even go as far as saying that you're grateful for the anxiety you experienced?
Big call there. Yeah, I the one thing that I think has been the most life-changing has been the impact on the people I know in my life. Like, meeting you. I've met so many cool people through talking about anxiety, friendships that I know I'm going to have for life. And there's a couple of people where they're like, if you're ever in New York or if you're ever in Canada or wherever, you need to come and see me. And I'm like, I will go and see you. I've met up with a couple of people online when they've been in Melbourne, met up with people in person that I met online through talking about anxiety. So that's something I'm super grateful for. And I think, I don't know, it's hard to say what trajectory I would have been on had I never had panic attacks. I don't know which way I would have gone, how my life would have turned out had I never gone down this anxiety rabbit hole. But I'm grateful that it has softened parts of me and I don't know, I guess given me a greater understanding of like how people can be going through something really hard and it can look from the outside like they're doing great and you have no idea. Yeah, I think it's given me a really sort of compassionate outlook. But yeah, I think I am grateful for it in a lot of ways. There are still things that I'm totally not grateful for. So it depends on the day.
Yeah, I think, did you ever get to the point when you were able to maybe understand what it was for you that was kind of lying underneath that anxiety? Because I think what I think sometimes happens that a lot of anxiety carries a lot of self-judgment, I think, for people in their own life in any regard. So I think that, the flavor of anxiety, as you put it earlier, which I found pretty good, is, yeah, maybe there's feelings of shame, feeling that you're not enough, or some underlying stuff. How's that something that, how have you worked for that in your life?
Yeah, I think that's something I'm still uncovering as I go. I think maybe I'll always be sort of uncovering new reasons as to why this all sort of popped up. I think shame is a huge one for me. I've always been a massive people pleaser. I've always really been really affected by other people's emotions as well. I was like a really sensitive kid. I cried a lot. I remember crying, like sobbing my eyes out once, thinking about my childhood toy, like my doll, and how my doll was going to feel when I grew up and didn't want to play with it anymore. And I was like so devastated by that. And this was at like 7 years old. So I've always felt really deeply, and I've always felt the need to make other people be okay. And I think that maybe, early relationships, like my first heartbreak, I took pretty freaking hard. And there was maybe a sense of that with like feeling not good enough, feeling not worthy, feeling unloved. And I feel like the time when my panic started to kick in was maybe another time where I was starting to feel maybe a bit unloved, maybe a bit like I wasn't good enough. But definitely for me, shame is a huge one, and especially with toilet anxiety. It's, you know, I think about what emotions I'd actually feel if I were to have this explosive bowel movement in front of lots of people. And I when I follow that thread and I think about how I would actually feel, it's nowhere near as horrific as I feel when I think about toilet anxiety. Like, what's the word? You know, when you're like worried about having a panic attack and having diarrhea, and you're like, oh God, and it's sort of, as I said before, that nebulous thing. It feels so bad. It feels so shameful. It feels so heavy. It feels like I can't possibly cope. But when I really sit and think about it, okay, how would I feel if this actually happened? It's not bad. It's uncomfortable. It's a bit embarrassing. It's, not great, but it's not the end of the world feeling that I get when I'm just sort of worrying about it. And I'm always curious to find out more about what that is. Like, why, when I'm making myself nervous about that happening, why does it feel so all-consuming? Why does my brain go, oh my God, that is the end of the world? Because it's just not, it's strange. And I love what you said when we spoke about this last time about being an inconvenience as well. That's been playing on my mind a lot, of feeling like an inconvenience to people. And what does that mean to me when I feel like, do I feel like a burden? Do I feel like I'm letting them down? Do I feel too exposed? Yeah.
As you were saying this now, and like how you sometimes acted as a child and how it maybe reflected on those experiences. One memory for me came to mind where I think it might have been a similar age, around 6 or 7, and I remember running into the living room crying. I was already in bed, and I had this vision of me, for some reason, standing in front of the church, giving like a speech to the whole church, as like maybe as you get like your Holy Communion or something, there might be whatever phrase or reference you might have to quote. And just that thought for me put me in so much panic. And I think this happened a couple of times. So I think it feels like there's, for a lot of people, these traumatic thoughts or experiences in their childhood that I think often in very complex ways then maybe aren't being processed and then later show themselves. And I think the feeling like, toilet anxiety, this idea of bodily functions, maybe the lack of control, to me, looking back, feels like such a, I don't know, it's just such a spot on way of your body to kind of highlight certain things without being able to spell it out, right? The idea of like, okay, you're experiencing shame here, you're experiencing the feeling of not being enough, how others will look at you. For me, this feeling of inconvenience, like the theme that I recognized for myself was always how others would look at me, how I might impact their day, that they just like how this anxiety and my behavior would essentially impact their opinion of me. And it's probably now that I've, taken this year as an opportunity to really dive into my own mental health and all the things that are going on. I recognize this one theme, like it's a red string that kind of goes through all of those topics of feeling lost, of feeling a little bit like without a clear purpose or identity, where I can recognize there's so much of that external pressure that doesn't exist. Because I think, as we talked about last time, not many people give a shit about you, probably. Not in the sense that they don't love you, but well, they've got their own thing going on. They're busy. You do your thing, and if you poo your pants in public, they're gonna be like, oh, that's a bit awkward, and then they probably look the other way and just move on. And maybe you'll be an anecdote at the dinner table when they're like, oh, you can't imagine what I've seen today, and that's about it, right?
Yeah.
But Yeah, I mean, this ongoing journey and growth, that you've mentioned, and even today you still see that anxiety. And for me, it's very similar. I wouldn't say that I'm past the toilet anxiety, because what I noticed, it's especially those moments when I am back in a situation where I experienced anxiety before, like at a
Mm.
hairdresser, as I'm getting my hair shampooed and washed. Like that's a moment where I thought this is just a couple of minutes, but it happened before when I had a bit of an anxiety attack and I had to like get up and use the bathroom just like with shampoo in my eye. So
Yeah.
now there's this little part of me as I'm feeling
Mm.
quite relaxed when I'm like, oh, remember when you had this
Mm.
panic attack? And do you still have that today? That, when you find yourself in situations where you used to be anxious in, that there's like part of you that's like, would suck if you'd
Yeah.
had another panic attack.
Yeah. Hey, guess what? Yeah. Yes. I it's timely that you mentioned that, because I was telling you earlier I went out for lunch with my parents today and we went into the city, and my dad was like, I'll drive, so you can have a couple of drinks. And I often drive myself places. I'm not usually in the passenger seat.
Mm.
And just the thought of like when I was driving to their place for them to then take me, my brain was doing that. It was like, hey, remember when you used to panic about this? And I was like, oh, like, I'm like, wait a minute, am I feeling panicky right now? And I really had to talk myself through that, which I'm good at now. Which, yeah, I've had enough practice now to know what to do when that happens. But I heard that because the way the brain works, I'm going to butcher this because I'm not very scientific, but apparently it's that whole the way we form a memory. So, something significant happens like a panic attack, and your brain takes in every part of that situation. So at the hairdressers, hair getting washed, smells, sights, sounds, all the things that are happening in that exact moment. And so that's all attached to that panic attack memory. And so when you're in that same situation again, the brain takes in all of those. It's like the recipe of, hey, last time this made a panic attack pie. Like, do you want to make that recipe again? Because all the ingredients are here, And
Yeah,
so it's that little switch that's like, oh, last time this happened, it was not a good situation. And your brain sort of brings that memory back to the forefront. And the thing about human beings and the way our brains and bodies work is that we can feel a memory viscerally. It's not just we think about it, we feel it
mm,
and we relive it over and over again. And so when you think about the time you had a panic attack, or when I think, hey, remember when I used to get panicked when people drove me? My body starts saying, yeah, my stomach used to do this and my hands used to do this and it used to feel like this. And then I'm like, oh shit, this is happening again. So
yeah.
yeah, it's a fun like those have you ever used those scratch and sniff stickers where you like scratch it and it's got a scent? I feel like it's that. It's like your body doing the scratch and sniff thing of like, hey, here's a panic attack.
Yeah, I feel like that's exactly how I've often been experiencing it with all of those memories kind of kicking in together. I think
Mm.
one thing that you mentioned earlier is that, well, it hasn't been this one thing, right? This one podcast and whatever, and like this conversation is not going to heal anyone who's listening to it, but maybe it can be this one ingredient. I feel like we're bringing a lot of food related phrases and reference in with like flavors and everything. I'm getting a little bit hungry now. But like it's usually like these little ingredients, right, that can help on this journey of dealing with anxiety, like accepting that part of yourself. And one thing that I realized is that you really, like, with everything that you do, you're building a little bit of a repertoire of ways how to deal with it, right? From, just breathing, or just remembering times when you've done okay, when you were able to get out. And I know that you're doing these calm community videos, right, every week, where you have like meditations. So can you explain what are you doing there, and how is that helping people to potentially get one additional ingredient?
Yeah. Yeah, so I think there's a lot of elements to finding sort of peace or some kind of sense of calm within your body. And for me, meditation is one of the big ones. I actually have trained as a meditation teacher because I loved meditating so much myself. And so many people I spoke to were like, meditation's not accessible for me. You know, like I try and quiet my brain and I can't do it. And, you know, I try and watch my breath and then I start to freak out about how I can't breathe. And like, I just can't meditate. I really wanted to learn how to bring meditation to these people who felt like it was not a tool that was for them. Because to be honest, in this day and age, I feel like we can all benefit in some way from just being with ourselves. And however you do that, whether you do that through a mindful walking meditation or you sit in with your arms like this and your legs crossed and humming om and things like that. However you choose to meditate, I think it's beneficial for everyone. So I started doing these calm community videos where it's just a really short, easy meditation. Like sometimes it's like breathe a couple of times and sometimes it's like move your arms in and out. And it's really short, really sweet, really easy to do. And then I would also add like a little prompt for the week. Like, you know, today I want you to think about how, God, I can't even think of one right now, but basically like you're going to be okay. Or, you know, how can I give myself more space in this moment? Just little things like that. So it's a very short meditation and a little cheeky prompt for people to anchor into their week. And the reason I called it Calm Community is because it was always a select few people doing the videos. It was like 4 of us that would come in and join in. And so it was like this little community of just people who deal with anxiety, deal with panic, and just wanted to like have 5 or 10 minutes to just check in with their body and breathe with other people on the other side of the world who are also experiencing the same thing. Because I think community is one of the massive propellants towards I went to say getting better, but feeling better. So yeah, that was the idea behind Calm Community. It was a way to have an accessible meditation and also a way to find that sense of community when you are somebody who is maybe isolated with agoraphobia or panic or whatever it may be.
Yeah, I think that's actually a very beautiful sentiment and probably a good opportunity to slowly bring this conversation to a close. Because for me, that community aspect, I think, is definitely something that I resonate a lot with, and is one of the biggest factors on this healing journey. I think the moment I started being capable of sharing my own story and receiving compassion from others and kind of fighting that shame that I often experienced or that I was often worried about, and just understanding how people are very supportive and often even accommodating. I think that's when you realize that, you know, and through extension, then it leads to, you know, conversations like this and other people that you meet who are in a similar position. And it suddenly goes from a place like toilet anxiety, which for me always felt like it forces you to get out of any instance and any situation with others, to kind of be completely isolated in the bathroom by yourself. And you're so lonely in many ways. So yeah, having that community aspect, I think, was a big factor for me as part of this healing journey. And one thing, what I do like to close with is asking you, when you think about growth, what is one message that you'd leave behind for others on this journey?
Oh, oh God. There's so many things I would want to say. When I
One
think about
thing.
growth. One thing. God. The genie at least gave 3 wishes, Flo. Christ. All right. I would say just don't stop being curious, and in every sense of the word. Like, be curious about who you are. Be curious about who the people you love are. Be curious about different modalities of healing. Be curious about, you know, are you the same person that you were yesterday? Are you still somebody who's not a morning person? Are you, you know, do you maybe actually want to try that class that you said you really didn't want to do, but maybe you sort of do want to do? Like, just keep that sense of curiosity about everything in life. I feel like that's the best way to stay on that path of growth, is not feeling like, you know, you know all the answers. None of us do. Yeah, just ask questions, be curious. That's that's it.
It's very profound, but I think that's a very beautiful sentiment to close this. So you already mentioned earlier your book, Here You Are Courageous, right? I think released by Hay House, everywhere available where you can find books.
Yep.
It's definitely something that
I like to go into the bookstores and sit to the front.
Yeah, you also have your socials, right? On YouTube, it's at Lauren Rose. The same on Instagram, right?
Yes, yeah. Although I have had a bit of a break from Instagram recently, so it's still there. All the content's still there. I just am not there myself very often. Yeah, was getting
But
an unhealthy amount of scrolling time in. But yeah, I'm still on
I
Instagram.
I definitely saw there's a lot of evergreen content. So even though, you know, you might not be there now, I think there's a lot of content that still holds very true. Like that video from 7 years ago where you talked about your total anxiety still feels very relevant to me today.
Yeah, awesome.
So
Thank
yeah,
you.
once again, Lauren, thank you so much for jumping on here as the very first guest of Grow with the Flow. It was a real pleasure to have you share so openly, because I think it's very unique and very special if people can speak so openly about the issues, especially when it's a topic that is, you know, quote unquote, so embarrassing. And taking
Yeah.
that out means a lot.
Thank you so much for having me. It was a joy.
Okay, then I'll speak to you soon, and yeah, have a beautiful rest of your day.
Amazing. Thank you, Flo. I loved this.